Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday. We have, is it 7 weeks off? You wish it was 1, yeah. Well, I kind of wish that too, but at the same time, we couldn't get through all the stuff we need to get through all week, so maybe it's good that there's still 7 weeks. A couple things to start with before I address the homework. Well, one thing at least. On your assignment sheet, the assignment that is due for next class, March 24th, which I'm calling worksheet 15. I think I already told you about that. It says to change the tenor clef to the bass clef in number 1. And I just want you to know that that is optional. Okay? You do not have to do that if you don't want to. If you want to write, well, I think it's probably a tenor line from an original 4-voice example. If you want to write that in using the tenor clef, which is provided for you on the handout I'm going to give you at the end of class, you're welcome to do that. If you don't like to deal with the tenor clef and you want to change it to the bass clef, you can take a pen and you can just write over the tenor clef and change it to a bass clef. That's fine. Either way is fine. I just want you to know that that's optional. Okay? So I just, yeah, that's one thing I wanted to tell you before I forget or get in too far into things today. Okay. And today, we are going to be talking about the trombone, not very long probably, and then we're going to get into the brass section as a whole so we can start scoring pieces for horns and trumpets and trombones and tuba. But before we do that, let me go ahead and return some homework that I've got, and then we'll look at the homework that you actually need for today. So for today, you have a handout on trumpet transposition. Should be called worksheet 14. There were 4 examples. I don't feel the need to, there's actually a workbook that comes with your textbook, and I don't have you guys purchase that because I only use a little bit out of that workbook. And I must say that the workbook pages that they have for trumpet transposition, they give you probably at least twice as many. But I don't feel it's necessary because, if you can do a handful of these, then I think you've got the ideal. And besides, that's a lot of writing anyways. So, I do plan to collect this assignment. So, as usual, does anyone have any questions about any of these before I pick it up? Yeah.
How do you find when you transfer the trumpet, the key signature?
Okay. So there are 2 on this assignment that I required you to use key signatures for. I said include a key signature except for the Strauss and the Scriabin examples. So the 2 examples in the middle you don't need any key signature for. You can just use accidentals as necessary. But for the top example, the Franck example, and the bottom example, the Weber example, yeah, I do want you to have key signatures there. So let's talk about the first one, the Franck example at the top. You can see that as it's given there, the transpose notation, there is no key signature at all. So I'll just assume then that the key for that, it doesn't matter if you figure it to be a major key or a minor key, it works both ways. But let's say the opening piece or passage there is in C major, written in C major. Okay. Well, then according to your book, how does the trumpet in F transpose? In other words, how do we find its actual sound, which is what we're trying to do for this assignment? Yeah, it sounds a perfect fourth higher than written. Right? That's what it says in the table in your textbook. Okay. So if the written key is C major, we go up a perfect fourth, and what major key would we get? F major, that's right. So I would say the key signature that you should use for the top front example would be the key signature for F major, namely 1 flat, B flat. That's what I would do for that one. And then all of the notes, you would go exactly a perfect fourth higher. And use accidentals as needed to make it exactly a perfect fourth higher than the notated written pitches. Then the bottom one, the Weber example, says trumpets in D. Now, according to the book, we know that trumpets in D, they sound a major second higher than written. So if, again, the written key, I have no key signature, if we just assume the written key is C major, then if you go up a major second from C major, what major key would you arrive at?
Hold on, did you say trumpet in D is in dog or trumpet is E is in elephant?
Oh, I said D is in dog, sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, the bottom one.
Sorry.
Yeah, the two ones in the middle you don't need key signatures for. Right. So trumpet in D is in dog. If it sounds a major second higher than written, and it's written in C major, what major key would we arrive at? D major, yeah. So I would put 2 sharps in the key signature as you prepare to show me what the actual sounds would be for the bottom. And then everything, all the notes that are listed here on the bottom example, you would just shift up a whole step in a major second. Good. Does that help? Okay. Are there other questions on this? Very well, then come around and pick these up and try to get these back to you by Wednesday.
Is this test case really similar to the last one we had?
Yeah, I would say. Unless you didn't like that one, I could try to make it 5 times harder.
Alright, thank you.
How's your Monday going so far? It's good. It's not a washout.
Yeah.
No. Even though it's supposed to, is it supposed to rain?
I think it's supposed to rain like a couple days.
Wow.
Until,
No,
when
definitely.
is it over there?
That will definitely be a washout. I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the, mostly the tenor trombone, not the bass trombone. And I'm certainly do not want to spend the entire class doing this because after that I want to talk a little bit about the brass section as a whole. And then after that, I even want to get you the information you need for your next program. So lots of stuff to get through today. The tenor trombone. Let's talk about its range, first of all. And that's found on the bottom of page 147. All these funky clefs, especially when they use tenor clef and other low C clefs, I tend to write the letter name of the pitch, so I know what we're talking about here. So it looks like the normal range for a tenor trombone The normal range is going to be the lowest pitch, if you can just kind of ignore temporarily the asterisk note in parentheses, the lowest note that the tenor trombone can get without any F attachments or any other attachments is going to be the low E bit. Okay, that's the open, extreme low range E there. The practical range is just a half step above. You know, I know from, do we have any trombone players? Well, I can speak from just a little bit of experience. I played the trombone in high school, when I was in high school. And I know that the E is, I mean, the F is at 6th position, the E is at 7th position. They're just as easy to get, so I don't think one is harder than the other. Anyway, the upper range, we have a B flat above middle C is the practical high range, and then an F even above that. I would say even the B flat, at least from a high school perspective, that's kind of a high note, the trombone. So, yeah, you don't want to go too much higher than any of those practical high ranges for the trombone. At least if you're going to be working with middle school students, high school students, that kind of thing. But there you have it. The low C, which is listed in parentheses here, as you can see, it is possible if your trombone has an F attachment. The trombone will have some extra coiling or tubing up at the top, and there will be a trigger or something near the handle here to open up that tubing and let the air flow through there. Sometimes it's called an F valve. So if you have that, then the super low C is possible. Sorry if I keep asking this, but class in, let's see, which class in brass talks about the 2 tutors? And is that being offered this semester? Is anyone taking it this semester? So you've all had it all. Okay. Do they talk about the F valve and all that? Don't need to necessarily go into detail with that. As a rule, instruments that are pitched in keys other than C are usually transposing instruments, but that's not so with the trombone. The trombone, even though it's built basically around the harmonic series of B flat, in fact, you can get all the notes of the B flat triad in first position, where the slide is all the way drawn in. Even though it's built around the harmonic series of B flat, the trombone sounds as written, so no transposition necessary for that instrument. Trombone music is notated normally, mostly in bass clef. You can see sometimes the tenor clef is used, and I think, as I mentioned, there is a tenor clef staff given on one of these examples on the homework that I'm going to give you. But for the most part, by far the majority, at least that I've seen, at least in high school, everything is written in bass clef. Let's see here. Instead of vowels, as you know, there's no vowels, although there is such a thing as a valve, a trombone with vowels. I have their picture. I don't know how common these are, but this comes from another book. You see, there's a picture of a trombone with vowels. Not nearly as common. Here's your standard tenor trombone right here. And instead of vowels, obviously, how does the trombonist change pitches? To this slot, that's right, to this slot. Okay. 7 different positions of the slide are used to produce harmonic series from the fundamentals that are shown in your book. You probably, class in brass, you talk about first position, second position is a little further out. Third position is where the handle kind of matches where the front of the bell is. Fourth position is a little further, and then fifth, sixth, and seventh position is full arm's length, basically. If you had a longer arm, you know, you'd end up throwing the slide off of the thing that it's attached to. But yeah, thankfully we don't have the monkey arm, so we won't do that. So, anyways, these are the fundamentals that the 7 positions of the trombone are used for. They're found on page 148. And again, these are fundamentals. Most of these pitches, if not all of these pitches, you don't ever sound, you don't play. Okay? For instance, the fundamental in first position is the B flat, and you don't normally sound the actual fundamental. The second partial, I should say, in that overtone series is an octave higher. All of them start an octave higher than these, and those are the main notes that you get. You see always sound usually the second partial, not the first partial overtone. So second position, you're going to get the notes of the A overtone series, the third position, A flat, fourth, G, fifth, F sharp, sixth, F natural, and seventh position, you'll get the overtones or the partials for the E harmonic series. That's how you access all of those. In music for the trombone, you may already know this, but it doesn't hurt to say it. It is not so much the distance between pitches that poses a problem, but it's the distance between positions of the slide that determines whether or not something is technically difficult to play or not. Okay, the positions of the slide. Certain notes, because they're on all these found in all these harmonic series, certain notes can be played in more than one position on the trombone. And in such cases, the player can choose whichever position is closest or easiest to wherever you're at on the terms of the slide. But there are certain notes that can only be taken in one position on the trombone slide. And when this is the case, very rapid or repeated changes from first especially to seventh position, or vice versa, those are pretty awkward. Just to illustrate that, the author has devised this little example on the bottom of page 150 of the book. And because the B and the A sharp and the A, these kinds of notes here, can only be taken and played in one slide position, the author is purposely trying to design this little thing to be played fast so that you can see how impossible it will be to play just using a tenor trombone without an F attachment. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, you see the numbers that are above the notes in this example? Those are the slide positions that you have to be in order to produce those pitches. So if you're playing this allegro and you're going dun 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 dun, can you, if you look at the numbers above those notes, can you go from seventh position to first position that fast, back and forth? Seventh position, arm's length, first position, all the way in. It's not very conducive to, I mean, it's not very idiomatic trombone writing, right? So you want to be careful about that, especially if you're arranging or writing something for middle school or high school trombone players that probably don't have the F attachment. If you have the F attachment and you can use the trigger and you open up the extra tubing, then different harmonic series become available to you. And the numbers down on the bottom, these show the slide positions that you can actually produce all those notes in with the trombone. And you see position from position 2 to 3 and back and forth and 1. That's not too bad. That's not too bad. I forget, what does the circle pitch mean? The F valve is the best for all positions except for those circles. Okay, so this is kind of an example of what not to write for your standard regular tenor trombone. Rapid running passages and light fanciful parts that skip around a great deal, they're obviously not well suited to trombone technique. But the instrument can play rapid repeated notes, including double, triple tonguing, things we've talked about with the other brass instruments. Flutter tonguing is also possible and effective on the trombone. If you like to use special effects or extended techniques. And of course, trombones can play, what can a trombone play? Like, for instance, if you start in one position, you keep the air continuity moving and you just kind of slide the slide out. What is that called? The glissando, that's right. So trombones are unique in that they can play the glissandos very well. But you're really not supposed to have a glissando be more than the interval of a tritone apart. That is shown on the bottom of page 151. Okay? So you see that top one of example 819 from a B flat first position down to the E in 7th position. That's about as large of an interval as you want to write a glissando for, if you ever write a glissando, because that's the extended length of the whole slide. And it will go into technicalities and say, you know, the very next one from G down to D flat is not going to be possible because the G that you start with is going to be in fourth position, and you don't really go down to 7th and then come back up and change the slide position and continue with glissando. There's going to be a hiccup there. You can work out the technicalities if you want to read about that. I don't think that's necessarily important for us to talk about during this course. It's a little beyond the scope of this class. But glissandos are possible. The trombone was used as early as 1600. In fact, it was even invented before that. Although it wasn't called the trombone back then. Does anyone know what it was called? It's going to be called the saxophone. Anyone? See if I can find a picture of something in this book here. Might be helpful for our purposes. Yeah, let's take a look at this. This is a book that I have from home. I kind of like it. It's not very complicated. It shows some simple, there's some simple information. So I don't know how detailed you get in your class in math too, but it says you're inventing the trombone. The first trombones were essentially trumpets with an added slide and were known as saplets. The name is believed to be a combination of the old French word saper, which means to pull, and botter, which means to push. So that's where you get your term saplet. Although widely used in the Renaissance and Baroque periods, it wasn't until the Romantic times it became a fixture of the symphony orchestra. That's not exactly true, although it's very close. We know that the first use of the trombone in a symphony was Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. So the classical, towards the end of the classical period, is when at least they first began to be used in the symphony orchestra. The design of the trombone has changed little over the centuries. Okay, what else can we learn about the trombone? I think it's kind of neat that you don't get in your reading. Let's take a look at this. You can see that. Making a trombone. Trombones are usually made out of brass. Skilled craftsmen, over here, shape the bell stem and flare using hammers and lathes. Then they make the rest of the tubing consisting of several separate sections. I didn't know this before. Each piece is filled with ice to stop it from buckling while they then get into shape. And then it says even metal balls are pushed through the tubing to make sure that it's the right diameter. And then the pieces are soldered together. I think that's kind of interesting. Did anyone ever want to be an instrument maker? I think that's kind of interesting. This kind of dovetails in with Dr. Kolbeck's, what is that, instrument repair class a little bit. Yeah, good to really do with that. So I thought that was kind of neat. Oh, and then there's this other thing. You maybe talk about this in class in brass too, I don't know. There's a did you know? Did you know that a trombone consists of more than 9 feet of tubing? I bet you the tuba has a lot more. You know, the more tubing you get coiled around, the lower the fundamental the only thing I'm going to say about the bass trombone is that it's usually made with a larger bell than the tenor trombone. And the bass trombone, it often plays the bass part in a piece alone, or sometimes in unison or in octaves with the tuba. So the bass trombone part, especially if you're in an orchestra, often plays what the tuba is playing. And in fact, in our homework, the next homework assignment, we're going to write for 3 trombones, 2 tenor trombones, and the third trombone is also a tenor trombone. We're not going to write for the bass trombone per se, but the third trombone is often coupled with and plays the same thing that the tuba plays, generally in octave high. generally not. All right. That's about all I need to say about the trombone. Generalized question about the trombone. I'm sure in class and dressing. You love that you get to play the trombone, right? You get to buzz your lips together and all of it. All right, and moving on. Let's go to the brass section as a whole. And this actually starts in the next chapter of your book, chapter 9, which is found on page 162. Let's talk about the size of a standard brass section for orchestra. How many horns do you think are standard for an orchestra? Are you raising a hand or are you giving me a number? Not sure. Yeah, 4. 4 horns. And by the way, I'm going to list these brass instruments in orchestral order. So believe it or not, again, I think we covered this at the beginning of the semester. In orchestral music notation, standard score order is that the horns are listed above the trumpets, even though the trumpets can play higher than the horns. So let's go to trumpets next. How many trumpets, well, according to your book, how many trumpets do you think are in a standard size orchestra? Okay, the book says between 2 and 3. So we'll go with that. 2 to 3 trumpets. And next come the trombones. And how many do you think there are there? 3. 3 trombones. And how many tubas are there? Just 1. 1 tuba is enough. One tuba is sufficient. I'm trying to think. Okay, maybe I'll discuss this just really quick. The author on page 163 does talk about that in scores for wind ensemble and band, the trumpets and the horns, they actually are, their order is flipped. So scores for bands and wind ensembles, the trumpets are listed above the horns. But for standard orchestral score order, you want the horns above the trumpets. And it's kind of neat, there is a little bit of an explanation on the bottom of page 163 about why this is. It says, apparently, the practice of placing the trumpets below the horns stemmed from the fact that in scores of the classical period, trumpets and timpani often played at the same time, their parts being very similar. So just think about this. What is, in an orchestral score order, what is the instrument that you probably get to next below the tuba? Percussion. And usually the timpani is the top or the first percussion instrument listed. Now, just think about back to the classical period. This is pre-Beethoven. Do we have trombones in the orchestra? Do we have tubas in the orchestra pre-Beethoven? No. So if these are not there, and the book is saying that trumpets, let's see here, trumpets and timpani often played at the same time, their parts being similar. Can you imagine putting the trumpets then below the horns and right next to what would be next in a classical orchestra, the timpani? Can you see how that might be advantageous? In fact, it says placing the trumpet part below the horn part allowed it to be directly above the timpani part because these instruments weren't there. The trombones only involved there. And this was felt to be an advantage. So I kind of think that's kind of neat, if you know a little bit of the history. But you might think, well, this just makes no sense. It's just backwards. What on earth? Why do we have it this way? Well, there might be an explanation why. See, there's usually a reason for these things that don't make sense. We just have to find out. Oh, and then I also like, there's lots of There's lots of typos in your text on page 163. I don't know if you can, oh, I took it away, but can you see over there, do you see trumpets is spelled without an E? So it just says trumps. And then, I don't know if you can see from where you are, how in the world did they spell ensemble for wind ensemble? Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I just think that's kind of funny. Wind ensemble. All right, that's beside the point. Okay. Now, there is an accepted truth, or the book calls it an axiom, about scoring for brass instruments in terms of depending on how loud or soft the dynamics are. And that's shown on page 162. You can read about that in your reading. Let's talk a little bit about it here. If the dynamics, when you're scoring for brass instruments, if the dynamics are mezzo forte or louder, what you need is you need to have two horns to balance out one trumpet or one trombone. If the dynamics are mezzo forte or louder, it's best to put two horns on a line when there's one trumpet on a different line or one trombone on another line. When the dynamics are softer than mezzo forte, then you can have one horn for every one trumpet and for every one trombone. Okay, so MP is softer. MF or louder is this. And that's just because the horns aren't nearly as loud, they don't have as much exploding or dynamic power as the trumpet and the trombone. So if you're scoring something for brass instruments and the dynamics are P, piano, soft, you're welcome to put one horn on a line and one trumpet on a line and one trombone on a line. The balance should be fine. But if the dynamics of something you're scoring for brass are, let's say, forte, F, then if you put one trumpet on one line and one trombone on another line, you probably should put two horns on a separate line for better balance. Okay? And so what that means is that we don't really know how well to score for brass accurately with balance unless we know what the dynamics of the passage are going to be. That's what that means. Okay. For purposes of illustration, on page 162 and 163, the author again uses the Jesu minor Freude example, the two measures of the Bach four-part chorale. And you can see that on the bottom of page 162. The original, the concert key of this, just like it was in other chapters, is E minor. That's without any transposition. And as we do with any kind of instrument that we score for, we should just look at the range of each of these four voices to see what instruments maybe can take them and what instruments maybe can't take them. Because we certainly don't want to pick an instrument and give it a line that's either too high or too low for it to play. Let's take the bass. I took out my brass instruments. What are the only basically, what are the two main instruments you should give this bass line here? Trombone and tuba, right? Can the French horn play that low? Yes, probably. But when the French horn gets that low, it's going to be a little bit softer, probably not going to be very solid, that kind of thing. So let's steer clear. I mean, unless you have to. I've actually seen, if you're writing for four horns, sometimes the fourth horn is given the bass line. You might see that. But let's not choose that as a first choice or anything like that, first option. Okay. So there are several examples now on page 163. And I'm gonna show them to you for a little bit here, and then I'm going to have to take them away so we can actually hear the sound files. And as in other chapters, you may notice here, I like to write in the margins which instrument has which of the original soprano, alto, tenor, or bass, so I know who's got what. So for these examples A, C, and E on the left, I put who's got SATB or whatever in various examples off on the left margin. And for examples B, D, and F, I put my cheat sheet or my notation, who's got SATB on the right margin. The very first example is pretty straightforward. Let's take one and then we'll listen to this one. Okay, what's this example scored for? Yeah, two trumpets and two trombones. So you give the trumpets soprano and alto, trombone, tenor, and bass. Really simple. Nothing much to it. Trombones don't transpose, right? But if the concert key of this passage is E minor, in what key do the trumpets in B flat have to be written? Okay, but let's try it in minor. F sharp minor, right? So that's why there's 3 sharps in their key signature. And all their pitches are a major second higher than the concert key pitches on the previous page. Right? So be careful when writing for trumpets. Yes?
And where it says, why is it that, sorry, I was about to start that. On the side where it says 2 trumpets and B flat, trombone 1 and 2, why is it written that way? Why don't you also have, like, why don't you say like 2 trombones or say they're both 1 and 2?
That's a good question. You could do either. I'm not sure why the author is grouping the 2 trumpets instead of saying trumpet 1 and 2, or just grouping the trombones and saying 2 trombones. That's right. Perhaps it's because, I don't know, I'd have to look at the rest of the examples on this page. Perhaps because all the examples on this page are just for 2 trumpets, whereas sometimes the trombones, there's 2 of them, sometimes there's 3. But otherwise, yeah, I don't really have a good answer for you. It's a little inconsistent. Let's look over here. And one thing I dislike about these examples is that the author says sometimes the horn parts have been written without a key signature. It just kind of drives me nuts. Let's just stay in the modern age here, you know. So I wrote the key signature in with the horns for these examples. If the concert key is E minor, then it's going to need to be written in B minor, perfect fifth higher for the horns, and that's why there's 2 sharps there. And you can see there's 2 horns there, SA, and then the 2 trombones, TB. Why can we have 1 horn on each line balancing out 1 trombone on each of the bottom lines? What's the dynamic level? That's a piano. You get the idea. Here's one for the standard brass quartet arrangement, example C. There's 1 horn in F, 2 trumpets, and 1 trombone. And because the dynamics are pianissimo, we have a fine balance with 1 on each line. Okay, what's an example D? What are the dynamics? Forte. Okay, so you see why one of the 2 trumpets is playing the soprano line in the middle. You see that one? Not both trumpets, just one. But because the 1 trumpet is forte, how many horns does the author use to balance out with the alto line? 2. 2 horns, both horns, 1 and 2 on the original alto line for balance. And then 1 trombone on the tenor, 1 trombone on the bass. And then maybe I won't play these until next class. Just look at the variety here. Here's example E. Oops. So we have 4 horns all playing here. 2 horns are playing the alto line, 2 horns are playing the tenor line, 1 trumpet playing the soprano, and 1 trombone playing the bass for a better balance. Because the dynamics are forte. Make sense? Okay. So When you're playing loud, if you got one trumpet on a line and one trombone on a different line, you want, if you can, you want two horns on a different line for better balance. Like that, dynamic level. And then finally, this one, example F, the author says is not satisfactory, so I have it crossed out. So you can ignore example F if you want to. I think this, in order to save a little time, can I play these examples next class? Okay. Because what I do want to do is I want to give you your next assignment, and then I want to spend maybe 5 to 7 minutes talking about your next coordinate. So let me give you the assignment for Wednesday first. It's brass scoring. Just follow the instructions. When you get this handout, if you look at number 1 on the top left, you'll see that one of the trombones is written with a tenor clef. Remember I said that's optional? If you want to change that clef to a bass clef, you're welcome to, but if not, just write the notes correctly in the tenor clef and you should be fine. Okay, so that's for Wednesday. Now, let's talk a little bit about the second scoring project. All right, tentatively, the due date for this scoring project is Wednesday, April 7th. Monday, April 5th, we have an Easter holiday. We will not be having classes. So you have like a super extra long weekend to kind of finish this one up. I was thinking I'd put the due date after the break. If, when we get to that time, if people are struggling to try to get it finished because it's a little bit bigger project than the previous one, I would be open to extending the due date. We'll just cross that bridge when we get there. Okay? All right, now, for those of you that have been in the wind ensemble at this school for many years, you have probably played a lot of prior students' arrangements. The last time I taught this class was in 2019, and the time before that I taught it was in 2017. And usually at the end of every semester, the wind ensemble will play the transcriptions or the arrangements. And you might say, well, I thought that was for the third scoring project. Well, this is actually preliminary work for the third scoring project. If you look at the first paragraph, it says, the second scoring project is intended to serve as preliminary work towards completion of the final project at the end of the semester. For this project, you're going to score the Grieg example named Sailor Song on the back of this page, scoring it for woodwinds and brass. The finished arrangement will then serve as the core of the final project, to which will be added saxophones and other musical elements. But the final project will still be Sailor Song. It's just to the woodwinds and the brass that you're doing for project 2, you're going to add saxophones and some other musical elements to finish it out. Okay? I don't necessarily want to read all of this, but look at section 2A. Arrange the Grieg piano piece on the back of this page. This is your instrumentation exactly right here. 1 piccolo, 2 flutes, 1 oboe, 2 clarinets in B flat, a bass clarinet, 1 bassoon, 4 horns, 3 trumpets, 3 trombones, and a tuba. That's a fair amount of instruments. Analyze the range of each of the voices in the original, which is on the back side here. Analyze that carefully before beginning so that you don't assign a line to an instrument that is too low or too high for it to play. I would like you somewhere in your arrangement to double the melody, that's the soprano voice on the back side. Double the melody 1 or 2 octaves higher, it's up to you. You've got flutes, you've got piccolo, you could double it. I mean, there's no problem, you should have no trouble doubling it, the melody 1 or 2 octaves higher. But make sure, you know, you have the original melody in the original octave too. Also, I should say, be played by one of these instruments, at least. Remember not to double any of the inner voices an octave lower, that's in bold, because that makes the whole arrangement sound too muddy and thick. Then if you choose to double any inner voices an octave higher, then you should do so for all of the inner voices in that particular passage. You can read the rest of the instructions, the details. Section 2b says be careful to use 1 and 2 and A2 correctly. You do not ever use DIV for this. DIV is used for strings. No DIV markings in your score. Just 1, 2, or A2, which means both sharing a line. If you could turn the page over and look at the score quickly, I want to point out a few things about it so that you can find your way around it. What do you think in measure 1 and then right after the repeat sign and then at the four bars from the end, what do you think the capital A, capital B, and capital A prime mean? Well, that's right. There's a form to this piece. And I think it's helpful to know that this is in like rounded binary form. You've got an A section, you've got a B section, although the B section, even though its length shows ternary, the fact that it uses motives and stuff from the A section, and the fact that it doesn't end in a different key or something, those things lead me to think that this is a rounded binary. But anyways, it's got an A section, a B section, and an A prime section. Maybe you can use woodwinds in one section, brass in another, and woodwinds or everyone at the end. You know, there's things that you can think about here. Okay, for when the opening material comes back at the end. Another thing I want to draw to your attention is this. I know it's kind of subtle, but what on earth do these little brackety things mean here, above the staff, and here, and here, and here, and throughout the piece? Does anyone know what those mean? What they refer to? It's not any kind of official musical symbol. It's just something I use to keep track of phrases. Phrases, that's right, phrases. So I guess what I'm trying to show you is that the first phrase is 4 measures. It ends right there. And the open bracket starting in measure 5, that starts another phrase. Do you see how that works? Okay. So the second phrase will start in measure 5 and go to the repeat sign. And then the next phrase is 4 measures long after the repeat. And then the next phrase is 4 measures long. And what about this phrase that starts in measure 17? How long is that phrase according to the bracket? 8 measures long. And then you have one 4-measure phrase at the end to recap from the beginning, the A material. The reason I show you the phrase breaks is because you can change instrumentation between phrases if you want. But within a phrase, I don't want you shifting and changing instruments. Like for instance, if you have the first 4 measures for woodwinds, I don't want you arranging measures 1 and 2 for woodwinds and then bringing in a tuba for measures 3 and 4. Let's keep, whatever you decide for a phrase, let's keep that instrumentation within and throughout that phrase. When the phrase changes, then if you want to change the instrumentation, you feel free to do that. But at least this way, whatever you start within a phrase, they're going to come to a cadence or a point of rest or a point of repose. And each line is going to be able to come to an ending rather than just cutting off in the middle of some line somewhere and then starting somewhere else. That just seems a little too choppy, and I don't care for that. Does that make sense? So there's a reason I put the phrase kind of markings. Right? Those are the main things. The other thing I want to mention, in the A sections, the bass is already doubled an octave lower in the piano part. Okay? So that's why it might look like there's a total of 5 voices. It's really 4-voice texture, but the bass in the A sections is just doubled an octave lower. You'll see that line just goes in parallel octaves with the other bass line. Okay? That's true there, and it's also true in the final A section. But in the B section, that's where you'll see the four voices most clearly. I know this is kind of quick and we're running out of time. Does anyone have any questions off the top of their head? Yeah.
Is this project the one that has to be done alley or spades?
This, well, just like the last project, I want this to be done using music notation software. Yes.
Well,
This-
can you do it on like MuseScore, or does it have to be flat?
No, you can do a MuseScore, that's fine. You will not need to extract parts for this project, but when we come back to this project for the final project and add the saxophone and the other musical elements, that one you will need to extract separate parts for all the instruments, so for the ensemble. Make sense? Okay. I better stop here because we're out of time, but look at this between now and whenever and let me know if you have any questions. So we got a lot of stuff in the works here.